Hello there, and welcome to another episode of what is increasingly becoming a series of Charlie Shows You a Completely Mental Knitting Machine. In this episode, we're going to have a look at the Knitmaster GB-1, also known as the Instant Knitter, which you will see in a second is an astonishingly bad name for it. It's a funny old machine, this. I kind of feel it barely qualifies as a knitting machine. It's more of a sort of semi-automatic knitting frame, I guess, because I mean, this was made at a time when Knitmaster made a very basic small knitting machine, and yet they also made this. And I have half an idea, it might have been just like designed by the son of the owner of the company or something, and everyone else had to pretend it was a marvelous idea, because it does things in a very, very bizarre fashion. Firstly, how a normal knitting machine works is fairly straightforward. There are four different stages. The first stage is that the needle moves forwards, and then the next stage is that it picks up the yarn, and then the third stage is it pulls it backwards through the knitting and creating a little loop. And then the final stage is it pushes the loop off the needle, and then there you go. You've got a whole row of little loops, which is the sensible way to do it. You leave the knitting where it is, and you move the needles backwards and forwards. Whoever's designed this has decided to leave the needles fixed in place and in fact move these little sinkers backwards and forwards, which in fact only does one of the four options, four things that a needle should do. Everything else you have to do yourself. Let me show you. So for example, in this one, and it actually works best if you use a ruler. I'd actually use a like an old school ruler if I were you, but you have to push the knitting back yourself, and you can see I'm pushing it backwards off the latches. There we go. So it's now sitting behind the latches. And then you have to put the yarn into the latches, and then you bring the knitting forwards, and it closes the latches over the yarn like so. And then the only thing that the actual carriage does is the bit where you push the knitting off the latches like this. Okay, so that pushes the knitting off the latches, and there you go. That's a row knitted. And then to do it again, you have to push it backwards and lay the yarn in, and then pull it forwards, and then knit a row. Now, I mean, they've called it the Instant Knitter. This is by some margin the longest it takes to knit a row of any knitting machine I've ever come across. And I suppose, you know, it is the answer to a question that nobody asked, which is what happens if you leave the needles completely still and only move the knitting. And by pretty much any estimation, it's not a great machine. It can't do any patterning at all. It takes 30 or 40 seconds to do a row, but I quite like it. I mean, it's mental. It's doing things in an unnecessarily difficult way at a time when the company made a simple, cheap, basic knitting machine that worked a conventional way. Ooh, all right. This one hasn't pushed back. Let's try it again. And I guess the only thing I would say is that there's a genuine pleasure to using it, and it's super quiet. So you could totally sit in front of the telly with this and just gently get on with it. And it's kind of cute. Like it's sweet. It's got the 1960s feel about it, and these rather nice curves to the counter. I'll tell you what feature it does have, which is extremely bizarre, and that is that it has a choice of how you'd like to push the carriage along. By the way, it also has this thing which it won't take the knitting off if you move the carriage, so that's quite nice. But if you don't want a handle like that, if you just think that handle is just far too passe, then you can take the handle off, like so. Unscrew it, pop it to one side, then you can take the centre red button out and screw in a slightly different handle. And I've never seen that before in a carriage, mostly I think because no one's actually asked the question, would it be useful? But I'm rather enjoying doing this. and it is rather sort of therapeutic just poddling along doing your own thing. And I'll tell you a big advantage, you get to see every single stitch being made. So it's much more difficult to make mistakes. I wouldn't say impossible, but it's certainly much more difficult to make mistakes. And as you go along, you just sort of gently enjoy it. So that's the Knitmaster GB-1. What I'll do right at the end of the video is I will zoom out so you can see the whole thing, the whole machine. But I'm going to pop this up for sale on my website. Not for a great deal of money, I don't think, but somebody will like it just because it's mad. And as I say, whisper quiet and, you know, quite good fun. And it's a thing of beauty. I mean, have a look at this whole thing. So there it is. You've got a special cast on braid there. You've got your little carriage there. It's extremely small, that's my hand. Incredibly small carriage. You've got your lovely little row counter there. And that really is the whole thing. This one was found unused in a box. So the only thing that was needed was so I need to sort of slightly straighten out the manual. And I needed to take it apart and give it a good clean and put it back together again. And there are one or two little bits where, for example, the chrome has come off the metal strip and so on. But it's pretty much unused. It's pretty much, you know, as new condition. It's just bonkers. I mean, one last thing, look, here, these needles, you can take these needles out of working position and push them back so that they don't get in the way when you knit. But, I mean, why? It's marvellous, but there's just no point to it. So I am enjoying this machine. I'm going to put it on my website, and I hope that somebody else enjoys it as well, and that wants to own it and love it and knit something amazing on this completely insane machine. Thank you.